Welcome back to the Unpack Mindset, folks. This is Jesse, your host. Man, California is crazy, man. I'm 100% convinced that these politicians are so disconnected from the people that they're supposed to represent. It's unbelievable, right? Let's check out this video and then we'll break it down, man, and then we'll talk about it.
California regulators approved new rules that will limit the type of tires you can buy when it's time to replace them on your car.
Yeah, while the California Energy Commission says that this is meant to save money for consumers, tire makers say that this will add to the cost of living here in the state. And KCRA 3 was the only TV station at the meeting today. KCRA 3 political director Ashley Zavala was there to watch the vote. So walk us through what this is supposed to do.
This was a lengthy hearing, and ultimately the California Energy Commission, in a unanimous vote, approved new rules that will phase out the sale of replacement tires that are currently sold in California that do not meet certain energy efficiency standards. It's expected to eliminate most of the tires that are right now sold in this state. The goal is for consumers to save money on gas or electricity if you have an EV by having more efficient tires. At the center of this is a tire's rolling resistance, or how much energy a tire uses as it rolls down the road. Lower resistance means a vehicle uses less gas or less electricity. New cars generally come with efficient tires, but consumers typically replace them with higher rolling resistance tires. This new rule comes in phases in California. So first, by 2029, California will only allow the sale of tires with a maximum rolling resistance level of 9.1. In phase 2, the standard lowers to 7.2 starting in 2033. That second phase means that an estimated 70% of tires currently sold in California will be eliminated from the market. The California Energy Commission has never regulated tires before, so this is a first. The commission claims the savings on gas and electricity will offset the cost of new tires in the beginning of these phases. The commission also claims this will improve air quality and provide other environmental benefits. But meanwhile, some tire makers have several concerns. Some say this is actually going to increase costs by limiting consumer choices. Here's what both sides of this new rule told us after the vote.
From the commission or the industry perspective, what we're really concerned about is the fact that these costs to the average, families in California that are, struggling with affordability, is that it's going to increase their costs by hundreds of dollars in phase 2. And we've highlighted that. And even in CEC's own data, you can see that. So we're rather disappointed that they move forward with phase 2.
Is there a backup plan if the California Energy Commission's expectations around cost savings aren't met with this rule?
Well, we're committed to doing this right. We are only doing it because we know it will save Californians money. So we're going to monitor. We're going to do our enforcement well. We have decades of experience with this. We have appliance standards that are saving Californians money every day. And so we're going to use that same capability that we have for appliance standards on this. And sure, we'll revise it if things become less practical, but we're pretty confident.
California is the first state in the nation to create a rule like this.
Let's start with the part that nobody talks about, right? The people making these decisions, the California Energy Commission, the commissioner, right, Nancy Skinner, she earns about $215,630 a year, right? That's about $17,000, I want to say $900 every month. It's a statutory salary paid by us taxpayers. She was appointed to a 5-member commission, if I'm correct, to represent the science and the engineering, right, seat. But the reality is this, right? She makes more in 1 month than many Californians make in 4 months. This is the classic definition, in my opinion, of what people call a latte liberal. Someone who lives comfortably enough, right, to never feel, right, the consequences of the policies that they impose on everybody else. When you're pulling nearly $18,000 a month, you don't worry about the price of tires, the cost of commuting, the price of gas, the cost of rent, you know, your mortgage, the cost of groceries, or the cost of keeping an older car on the road, right? But millions of Californians do. Crazy, right? You know, it's like every single day, and that's why this, you know, this regulation, right? This tire mandate, it feels cold, man. It's elitist and it's disconnected from reality. You know, let's talk about the regulation itself, right? California's new replacement tire efficiency rule, I believe that's what they coined it, um, approved by the California Energy Commission and championed by Nancy Skinner. And you know, it's being sold as a climate win, man. Literally, they think that this is a win, you know. But for millions of Californians, right, it feels like it's something very different. You know, it's another policy written in a conference room that ignores, you know, how people actually live, right? You know, the regulation sets a rolling resistance cap, I want to say, of 9.1, right? They're trying to meet that by 2029, and then bring it to 7.2, right, by 2033, I want to say. You know, on paper, man, that sounds technical, right, and harmless, right? But in reality, you know, the industry data shows that that's up to, I want to say, 70% of the tires currently sold in California, right, would fail those thresholds, right? That includes, you know, the budget tires, you know, the classic car production tires, you know, off-road, all-terrain, mud tires, you know, used for or tires used for work, right? Or, you know, that are imported, right? And they're affordable brands. This isn't a small tweak, folks. You know, what else are these environmental goons going to purge, right? You know, it's not a market, it's a market-wide purge. You know, that's what it is. You know, 70% is not a small figure, right? And it's happening in a state where the cost of living is already crushing families, man. You know, California's median rent is over what, $2,700 a month. Gas prices they routinely sit at about $1.50, $1.75, you know, above the national average, and residents pay some of the highest combined state and local taxes, right? In the country, you know. And when you're living in that reality, man, it's like being told you need to be you need more efficient tires, right? And it's cold, right? It just doesn't hit right. Even if they cost $40 to $100 more per tire, you know, it doesn't feel like environmental stewardship, man. It feels like another bill, another mandate, another reminder that Sacramento is never listening. You know, look at the classic car community, man. A direct hit. California has one of the largest, you know, classic car cultures in the nation, right? And we're talking about lowriders, you know, muscle cars, you know, in the Inland Empire, right? You know, all over the place, man. You know, these vehicles are rolling history, right? You know, you know, classic cars, right? They rely on these tire sizes and compounds, right? That do not exist in this low rolling resistance standard, right? I don't know, man. It's like you know, you see these lowriders, right, with these reproduction white walls, right? These you know, these muscle cars, right, with these tires that have different tractions, right? And you got these vintage European cars, right? That you know, these tires, they're not mass market products, right? You know, you're cutting all these people off. You know, manufacturers aren't going to redesign them for one state's regulation. You know, that means that, you know, classic car owners and muscle car owners, they're going to probably lose a lot of options, right? Or they're going to have to leave the state to go find, you know, the proper tire, right, for their vehicles. You know, it's completely disrespecting California's automotive heritage, man, and it feels like erasure, right, disguised as efficiency. You know, and then you got your off-road tires, right? You got your off-road tires that have high, you know, that aren't going to fall in that high rolling resistance, right? They got the deep lugs, you know, they got the reinforced walls, they got aggressive tread blocks, man, and these are all essential, right? For these rocky terrains, right? And it's crazy, man. And California is home to millions of trucks, Jeeps, Broncos, Tacomas, and Forerunners, right? And these aren't just toys, folks. These are work vehicles, man, family vehicles, weekend escape vehicles, man. And the regulation is basically saying, F you guys, man. You guys are all inefficiencies, man, and your necessities just don't matter. You know, the economic disconnect that California officials estimate, they're saying that it's going to be $6.50 per tire more, man. That's garbage, right? Industry groups estimate more of like $40 to $100 per tire, depending on the size and the category. That's not a rounding error, man. That's the difference between groceries, utility bill, man. That's the difference between replacing tires and driving around with wires just hanging out for another 6 months, right? For some people, man, that's their reality, right? And here's the part that stings. Budget tires, man, they're just not for low income, right? It's not just a low income product, right? They're what normal Californians buy, right? Including people with solid incomes, families with multiple cars, right? And young adults trying to stay afloat, right? That regulation wasn't written for them. I mean, I've had my A to B cars, right? These are just cars that I use to get from A to B and come back, right? I'm not dropping a lot of money on tires for my A to B car. I feel like it was written for like a theoretical driver, right? With a new EV and a short commute and a comfortable budget, man. And that's not California, man. That's a fantasy, right? But what's not surprising, man, is Nancy Skinner, right? She's got a history, man, of regulatory aggression, man. I did some background on her, and her name, it didn't immediately ring a bell, right? But she's responsible for the SB2 and the SB 45-2, right? She was trying to go after people's Second Amendment rights, right? And he was trying to tighten firearm restrictions in California. Whether one supports or opposes those laws, man, they were widely criticized, right, for overstepping, overregulating, and ignoring the realities of the lawful gun owners, right, and the community, right. She's now applying that same approach to tires, man. Every product, every driver needs, every family relies on, and every commuter burns, through faster than they like, right? It's something that we all buy, we all purchase. To many Californians, man, this is an environmental leadership, man. It's a pattern, right? It's like regulate first, consider consequences later. The core issue, right? You have a government that isn't listening. Californians aren't angry because they hate clean air, right? It's a weird I don't know, space that these people are in, man. They're so out of touch, so tone deaf. You know, it's like, they're angry because they're tired of being told, right? You know, the citizens, man, we're all angry, right? We're tired of being told of what we could buy, what we can't buy, what we could afford, what we can't afford. We're tired of policies that raise costs, reduce choices, and ignore cultural realities, right? Ignore economic realities and ignore geographical realities, ignore the people who actually live here. This tire regulation, man, it's not about rubber, man. It's not about the environment. It's about trust. And whether people writing these laws understand the people living underneath them right now, many Californians feel like the answer is no, man. We got to do better. We got to do better as citizens, right? We need to, have our voices heard, man. We need to get out there and we need to let these people know, man, you're out of control. You know, you can't just be, you know, infringing, right? And getting, you know, putting yourself out there and telling us what we can and what we can't buy, man. I just feel like we all got to do better, man. We all got to do better here in California because these people are out of control, man, and they're just completely disconnected. Anyways, if you like my content, subscribe, like, and share. And you guys have a good night and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.